28. Ahab. For several days after leaving Nantucket, nothing above the hatches was seen of Captain Ahab. The mates regularly relieved each other at the watches, and for aught that could be seen to the contrary, they seemed to be the only commanders of the ship. Only they sometimes issued from the cabin with orders so sudden and peremptory that after all it was plain they commanded vicariously. Yet their supreme lord and dictator was there, though hitherto unseen by any eyes not permitted to penetrate into the now sacred retreat of the cabin. Every time I ascended to the deck from my watches below, I instantly gazed aft to mark if any strange face were visible. For my first vague disquietude touching the unknown captain, now in the seclusion of the sea, became almost a perturbation. This was strangely heightened at times by the ragged Elijah's diabolical incoherences uninvitedly recurring to me, with subtle energy I could not have before conceived of. But poorly could I withstand them. Much as in other moods I was almost ready to smile at the solemn whimsicalities of the outlandish prophet of the wharves. But whatever it was of apprehensiveness or uneasiness, to call it so, which I felt, yet whenever I came to look about me in this ship, they seemed all warrantry to cherish such emotions. For though the harpooners, with the great body of the crew, were a far more barbaric, heathenish, and motley set than any of the merchant ship companies which my previous experiences had made me acquainted with, still I ascribed this, and rightly ascribed it, to the fierce uniqueness of the very nature of that wild Scandinavian vocation, in which I had so abandonedly embarked. But it was especially the aspect of the three chief officers of the ship, the mates, which was most forcibly calculated to allay these colorless misgivings, and to induce confidence and cheerfulness in every presentment of the voyage. Three better, more likely sea officers and men, each in his own different way, could not readily be found, and they were in every one of them Americans, a Nantucketer, a vineyardman, a Capeman. Now, it being Christmas when the ship shot out from her harbor, for a space we had biting polar weather, though all the time running away from it to the southward, and by every degree and minute of latitude with which we sailed, gradually leaving the merciless winter and all its intolerable weather behind us. It was one of those less lowering but still gray and gloomy enough mornings in the transition, when a fair wind the ship was rushing through the water with a vindictive sort of leaping and melancholy rapidity, that I soon mounted to the deck at the call of the forenoon watch. So soon as I leveled my glance toward the taffrail, foreboding shivers ran over me. Reality outran apprehension. Captain Ahab stood upon the quarter-deck. There seemed no sign of common bodily illness about him, nor of the recovery from any. He looked like a man cut away from the stake, with the fires overrunningly wasted all the limbs without consuming them, or taking away one particle from their compacted, aged robustness. His whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze, and shaped in an intolerable mold, like Cellini's cast Perseus, threading its way out from his gray hairs and continuing right down one side of his tawny, scorched face and neck, till it disappeared in his clothing. You saw a slender rod-like mark, lividly whitish. It resembled that perpendicular seam sometimes made in the straight, lofty trunk of a great tree, when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it, and without wrenching a single twig, peels and grooves out the bark from top to bottom, ere running off into the soil, leaving the tree still greenly alive but branded. Whether that mark was born with him, or whether it was the scar left by some desperate wound, no one could certainly say. By some tacit consent throughout the voyage, little or no allusion was made to it, especially by the mates. But once Teshtigo Sr., an old gay-head Indian among the crew, superstitiously asserted that not till he was full 40 years old did Ahab become that way branded, and then it came upon him not in a fury of any mortal fray, but in an elemental strife at sea. Yet this wild hint seemed inferentially negatived by what the gray Manxman insinuated in the sepulchral man, who, having never before set out from Nantucket, had ever laid eyes on this wild Ahab. Nevertheless, the old sea traditions, the immemorable credulities, popularly invested this old Manxman with preternatural powers of discernment, so that no white sailor seriously contradicted him when he said that if ever the Captain Ahab should be tranquilly laid out, which might hardly ever come to pass, so he muttered, then whoever shall do it that last office for the dead would find a birthmark on him from crown to sole. So powerfully, the whole grim aspect of Ahab affected me, and the livid branch which streaked it, that for the first few moments I hardly noticed that not a little of his overbearing grimness was owing to the barbaric white leg upon which he partially stood. It had previously come to me that his ivory leg had at sea been fashioned from the polished bone of a sperm whale's jaw. He was dismasted off Japan, said the old gay-head Indian once, but like his dismasted craft, he shipped another mast without coming home for it. He has a quiver of 'em. I was struck by the singular posture he maintained. Upon each side of the Pequod's quarterdeck and pretty close to the mizzen shrouds there was an auger hole, bored about half an inch or so in the plank. His bone legs steadied in that hole. One arm elevated and holding by a shroud, Captain Ahab stood erect, looking straight out beyond the ship's ever-pitching bow. There was an infinity of firmness, fortitude, and determinate, insurrenderable willfulness in the fixed and fearless forward dedication of that glance. Not a word he spoke, nor did his officers say aught to him, though by all their minutest gestures and expressions they plainly showed the uneasy, if not painful, consciousness of being under a troubled master's eye. Not only that, but the moody, stricken Ahab stood before them with a crucifixion in his face, and all the nameless, regal, overbearing dignity of some mighty woe. Ere long, from his first visit in the air, he withdrew into his cabin. But after that morning he was every day visible to the crew, either standing in his pivot hole, or seated upon an ivory stool he had, or heavily walking the deck. As the sky grew less gloomy, indeed, he began to grow a little genial. He became still less and less a recluse, as if when the ship had sailed from home, nothing but the dead wintry bleakness of the sea had kept him so secluded. And by it came to pass that he was almost continually in the air, but as yet, for all that he said or perceptibly did on the last sunny deck, he seemed as unnecessary there as another mast. But the Pequod was only making a passage now, not regularly cruising. Nearly all whaling preparatives needing supervision, the mates were fully competent to. So there was little or nothing out of himself to employ or excite Ahab now, and thus chase away for that interval the clouds that layer upon layer were piled up on his brow, as ever all clouds choose the loftiest peaks to pile themselves upon. Nevertheless, ere long, the warm, warbling persuasiveness of the pleasant holiday weather we came to seemed gradually to charm him from his mood. For as when the red-cheeked dancing girls, April and May, trip home to the wintry misanthropic woods, even the barest, ruggedest, most thunder-cloven old oak will at least send forth some few green sprouts to welcome such glad-hearted visions. So Ahab did in the end, a little respond to the playful allurings of that girlish air. More than once did he put forth the faint blossom of a look, which in any other man would have soon flowered out into a smile. This is the end of chapter 28. And we finally see Ahab. Now, there's a few things about him. So, most of the New Englanders, the Quakers, it's very common back then to wear dark clothes. That was just kind of the Quaker way. Quakers plain dressed. The Puritans, the Pilgrims who settled New England back in the 17th century, 16th century, that sort of carried through into the 18th and 19th century when this takes place. So it's a very dull, dark clothing, and Ahab is typically presented like that. Except here you have this stark, white, ivory leg. So, he lost his leg to the whale. We all know this, it's mentioned before. And he has a fake leg except instead of being made out of wood, it's made out of whale ivory, much like much of the Pequod is. So Ahab is kind of a mirror of the Pequod, which is a very common thing. I mean, in classical times, in the Renaissance, before in the Dark Ages, there was this sense that the king mirrors the kingdom. If the kingdom is sick, then the king is sick. If the king is immoral, then the kingdom is immoral. So here you have Ahab, dark and somberly dressed, with a bright ivory leg of whalebone. And here you have the Pequod, dark weathered wood, with whale's teeth and whalebone making up large parts of it. Also mentioned that Ahab had this long scar running down the side of his face. Probably down his whole body from the sounds of it. And one of the people on the ship said, you know, whoever buries Ahab is going to wind up with a scar just like that. So it's kind of reminiscent of the mark of Cain, which is from the Bible, back in Genesis, the story of Cain and Able. Cain was jealous of his brother and killed him. And, you know, so you had Adam and Eve, the first people ever made. Their children, Cain and Abel, and then later others. Their children, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. So here you have person 3 killing person number 4. The third person killing the fourth person ever. And God said, okay, Cain, you are banished. Go. But I'm going to put a mark on you. So God put a mark on Cain to say that, well, actually, the mark was a mark of protection to say, do not touch him. But the mark of Cain has come down to mean a sign of being cursed. So this is kind of the sign of Ahab being cursed. And so he has this long white streak on him that they don't think came from any fight or any dealings with the whale or any whatever. They described it to a tempest. So it was like a storm, like he was struck by lightning, and they compared it to a tree struck by lightning. Though Ahab probably wasn't struck by lightning. Maybe it happens. Anyway, so he has this long scar. He has this white ivory leg. And one really cool thing that they mentioned was he had these peg holes drilled in the ship. So any place he's likely to want to stand, he put a hole in the ship. So he can walk, stomp his peg leg down, and just kind of swivel around it. So he wants to look left, hops around on his leg to the left, hops around on his leg to the right. And he can keep the peg leg still. And that leg isn't going to slip out from underneath him, even in the stormy seas. So he can be like braced and stuck in place, because peg legs don't typically give good motion, because you can only apply force straight down. When you press with your foot, your toes can balance, and you can get this sort of torque motion, so that, you know, if your toes and heel are both down, you push down with your toes and it kind of pushes you forward. But the thing is that with the peg leg, all the force is just done transversely, which means that you can't generate that moment, and at best you can do is hope not to slide and pick it up with friction. So that is chapter 28 and Ahab.